So it's great to be back here again for this fifth weekend of the Assembly. And as Alan said, my role this morning is to talk about how the political parts of the system can help ensure standards are upheld. We should consider this before thinking about whether other additional kinds of constraints that the other speakers will consider are needed. So, as Alan said, the political constraints in the system are mostly things we've talked about in previous weekends. They're often quite subtle systems of influence that encourage accountability, transparency, and good behaviour. So if we return to the structure of government, which we discussed in the third weekend, we know that at the heart of government are politically neutral civil servants reporting to ministers who are parliamentarians from the governing party or parties. These ministers are chosen by the Prime Minister, who decides whether they should keep their jobs. All ministers, including the Prime Minister, are also accountable to Parliament, attending regularly to answer questions and explain themselves. As we've discussed before, the government needs to retain what's formally called the confidence of the House of Commons. If it loses that, it can be removed from office. There are wider pressures as well within which Parliament sits. Parliament's a very public place. Journalists attend, there are TV cameras running, and decisions often reach the news. This supports the most crucial form of democratic accountability between members of Parliament and the voters. Voters can hold politicians accountable directly, for example, by writing to or meeting with their MPs, and they also access information via the news. If the voters are unhappy at the next general election, they can choose to vote against their local MP and maybe vote the whole government out of office. At every level in this system, policymakers know they're being watched and they have to be accountable. So ministers account to Parliament and also to the Prime Minister, who decides whether they can keep their jobs. The Prime Minister must also account to Parliament as well. And then all MPs are accountable to the media and to the voters. Now, hopefully people who become politicians have good motives and want to behave well. But the fact that whenever politicians take decisions, they have somebody looking over their shoulder and they need to explain themselves creates added incentives to good behaviour. So to take a particular example, if a minister does something inappropriate or just doesn't perform very well, they'll need to answer to Parliament. They'll also need to answer to the Prime Minister, who might decide to remove them from the government. In thinking about this, the Prime Minister will consider the merits of the case in terms of whether the minister deserves to go. But they'll also think about how the decision will look. If a Prime Minister chooses to keep a badly performing minister, they could be punished in Parliament, in the media, and by the voters. A particular question arises with respect to what happens if a minister or the Prime Minister lies to Parliament. At the moment, it's left purely to these kinds of political pressures to sort it out. That all applies to standards of good behaviour, which we've heard a lot about in recent weeks. Jane will say more about this shortly. But similar arguments apply to making policy and the law. As we've discussed before, Parliament oversees the policy proposals put forward by ministers. In the same public environment, with the media and pressure groups watching and the voters able to judge and vote the government out of office in due course if they don't like its policies. In the UK system, as Alan's reminded us, Parliament is officially sovereign, so sits at the top of the decision-making tree. This means its decisions can't normally be overturned, for example, by the courts, which Chris is going to speak about later. Many policy decisions are partly a matter of taste, but we do probably want to judge policies against some kind of standards as well. Three important kinds of standards are kept under review by particular committees in Parliament. First, a committee considers whether bills proposed by the government give too much future power to ministers. You'll hopefully remember that we spoke in weekend 3 about secondary legislation, which gives ministers power to make future changes without the need for full parliamentary approval. Parliament has to decide whether to grant this, so the committee advises whether the powers being asked for by government are reasonable. Second, there's a committee that considers whether new policies are contrary to basic human rights. And a third committee considers whether new policies are problematic in terms of other constitutional standards. For example, maintaining free and fair elections or the right to a fair trial. It asks whether new policies fit with the traditions of our constitution. All three of these committees are just advisory. They report to Parliament, and Parliament as a whole takes the final decision. Because of parliamentary sovereignty, if MPs decide to support a government proposal that would breach any of these standards, that's really their decision to take. Like with ethical standards, they ultimately answer to the voters. The key question for this weekend is to what extent such decisions, both on standards of ethical behaviour and on policy, should be left to the political mechanisms I've described, or whether there should be other kinds of oversight and enforcement. Sorry, forgot to click on my slide there. It's very easy to make arguments on both sides. On the one hand, we might think political mechanisms of accountability through Parliament, the media, and the voters are the most democratic. There's a clear chain of responsibility from government to Parliament and Parliament to citizens, leaving citizens ultimately to decide. On the other hand, we might have some worries about the political checks. First, if the government has a party majority in Parliament, it might be too easy to persuade MPs to ignore unethical behaviour or to support decisions that, for example, harm minority rights. A lot will depend on how much MPs in the government's party are prepared to stand up to their leaders. Likewise, the media can be quite political, and even citizens might tolerate bad behaviour from a government that they support, or perhaps not even be watching carefully enough. So what should we do in response to these kind of concerns? If political processes don't decide matters, then who should? The next two talks are going to discuss this. But whichever system we choose, we need to remember that democracy depends on the support of the voters. There's a tension here. If the voters' views were completely overridden, they might turn against the democratic system. So we need a political process, but sometimes perhaps we also need to keep it in check. And if we think there's a role for unelected bodies in maintaining standards and good democratic behaviour, there'll always be difficult questions about where to draw the line. Thank you.